Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome. And I hope you stick around and subscribe. But if you're unfamiliar with my background, I have a journalism background. I've written for a lot of major publications for over 15 years, particularly as a freelance writer. And of course, I'm well aware of where the media has sort of lost its trust, has gone astray, and the deterioration that has happened. And a lot of times we talk about bias in media and the fact that many journalists have entered the field in recent years and become more activists than journalists. And of course, that is a problem. However, one thing that is often missed is what happened in terms of the financial incentives. So, this is something that I wanted to touch on today. So, it's funny. I started my career in sort of a reverse sort of way. So I say that because I was I started an online magazine, and I was also editing different online publications back when the internet was sort of the wild wild west. And then I went in reverse and started writing for print. And then, now the internet sort of runs things. But the really big aspect of it is that once the internet became mainstream, and that's where a lot of publications went, it actually hurt journalism quite a bit. So on the one hand, you had a lot more publications. The opportunity to create a new publication was much easier than to start your own print magazine. But at the same time, quality journalism, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to write a quality story, right? If you want to do research, especially if you want to do investigative journalism, which is really, something that's often lacking, that takes a lot of time to do. And so as a result, time is money, right? It's expensive, especially if you want to get a good journalist involved. And the financial incentives really sort of shifted, because what happened is, clicks became the main motivator, because especially since a lot of the content is free, and paywalls, um, especially in the beginning, paywalls did not do very well, and now paywalls do well in some cases, not so well in other cases. Advertising is a key driver for a lot of publications. um, what happens is, when your key motivators to get clicks in particular, you want to produce content that isn't necessary is going to get you those clicks, but you also want to minimize your costs. So if you're paying a journalist to work on a story, and that story takes a long time and it's intensive, and you're paying them a lot of money to do it, either they're a freelancer and you're paying them, by the word or by the article, or you have somebody on staff and they're going to be working on that story for a period of time, and when they're unavailable to do other work, you're really allocating a lot of resources for that story. And that story might not get the same clicks as another story that's much cheaper to produce. So a story that might, take somebody an hour, half an hour, or 20 minutes even to write, because it's referencing some other publication. It's scandalized, it doesn't have any research done, research involved. And yet, so you're either paying somebody to do it, or you're producing in-house, and that same journalist is now doing 5, 8, 10 stories a day, and it's getting potentially more clicks, more advertising. So that's, I think, a really big factor in why we've seen such a destruction in journalism. So beyond sort of the bias and um, some of the other issues around, the ideological factors involved in journalistic and sort of integrity. And then you've got this kind of sense you have to also be really fast, right? So stories have less time to be researched, to be verified, because everything's on the internet, and the faster you are, you're incentivized to be first. Again, for those clicks. So that's a pretty major problem, and it's very difficult to overcome. So we really need to be looking at other models. And I think people are sort of coming around to where I think there's a lot of people who are willing to now pay for quality. And we see that because, for things like Substack and wanting to support other forms of journalism, independent journalists that they like, or journalistic organizations that produce higher quality work. Um, People want more, but is it too late? That's hard to tell, because these kinds of stories that go viral, they're still doing very well. And another thing that's sort of would be kind of interesting to note for journalists, for example, for a freelance journalist back in, I think, like the 80s, a good rate would have been considered $1 a word. Okay, that was considered a pretty good rate. Some journalists earned more than that, maybe $2, $3, depending what they were doing and who they were. And now, even now, that is still considered to be a pretty good rate. But note, inflation. Our currency was worth very different amounts. So, you know, that plays a big role. And that means, again, that a journalist has less quality time to spend on each individual story. And time is a very important currency, because the more time I have to spend on a story, the more I'm getting paid for it. The more time I have to research it, to verify my facts, to find really good sources, to really learn about what I'm writing, the things that I'm writing about, chase things down. So I'm going to write something that is of much higher quality. And now we have all these Twitter journalists and amateur journalists, and even for my own Substack, you know, I don't really make, I make I have a few supporters, which I really appreciate, but it's nowhere near close to anything that I'd make, writing for a magazine or a newspaper. And so, the amount of time, because essentially I'm volunteering that time that I'm able to spend on a story is so much more minimal than what I'd be able to spend on a story if I'm actually assigned that story. So all of those things play quite a significant role in the dynamics of, what kind of media output we get in our stream of our media diet. And with AI, which is, they're trying to get it to replace writing things like news, which is actually kind of doable. I think for certain kinds of writing, it could be helpful. I think news is not a very I think you're going to need journalists who do data collecting, reporting, finding the information, and then you can input it, and it's going to more quickly turn out that story. That can actually be kind of useful. But things like features and interviews and things that take a lot more human time and consideration, the financial incentives play a really significant role that I think the public doesn't always fully realize. And the song used to be "Radio killed the video star." I mean, sorry, "Video killed the radio star." I mean, and then it was like the internet killed newspapers and the magazines, and in many ways it sort of did. I mean, we still have newspapers and magazines around, but it's not the same. And also the other aspect of it, people don't have the same attention span if they're reading online, so the stories are much shorter. So I've noticed, even with print, the things that I've been commissioned to write, either way, have often been a bit shorter. And that plays a role too. If their budgets are smaller and say I'm being paid by the word, say I'm being paid, a dollar a word or even $2 a word sometimes, but I'm getting like 500 words to work with, there's a lot of nuance that gets lost in the piece. They're kind of tight, concise pieces, and they're not bad, but they don't have the same scope of something that I'd really like to write. I probably would have liked to write 1,000 more words, and why brevity is important. Um, we lose a lot as well. And again, that is something that has to do often with finance, and not just editorial decisions. So all these things, like I said, they play a role. And while I think the conversation tends to focus mostly on things like bias, I think the financial incentives are just as important. And the other part of it is that's also really important is that you have um, all these media outlets also uh, uh, coming together. So and being bought by the same parent company. So you see that a lot in the US. You see that in Canada as well. You have a lot of syndication happening where you don't even have original stories in most of the papers. Like there's a little bit of local community coverage, and then most of it is just syndicated from sort of the parent company or from a newswire. So you have very little original reporting, and journalists are losing their jobs as well. So there's fewer reporters, fewer original reporting that's happening. So you lose that breadth of perspectives, which isn't necessarily, again, it's not necessarily a bias thing. It's just a financial thing. And a lot of magazines, newspapers, particularly sort of the community-oriented independent ones, haven't been able to survive, or they've laid off their staff and they are just sort of using these syndicated content essentially from newswires. So that's happened a lot. I mean, Canada, we barely have, there's very few publications left. Like, there's not that many. In the US, there's a lot more, but they'll have these like parent companies, conglomerates, and, you know, they'll sort of share a lot of content as well, or kind of control a lot of the coverage. Although there is some independence there as well, but a lot of it is very much a financial thing, and often, if one of these parent companies goes under, you lose like a whole bunch of magazines, newspapers at the same time. So that's another thing to consider. But I think we really need to have more of a conversation about that and the financial structures and how we might want to adjust that. And maybe I'll, uh, look into doing more videos on that if there's interest, and exploring some ideas for the future. But you know, ideology is trickier to change in some ways, and more vague. And I think financial structures play, I think, a bigger role than most people realize. And I think it's important to understand how that works. Um, that's it for now. I hope that wasn't terribly boring. And let me know your thoughts if you have any, and what content you'd like to see in the future. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and helps me bring new content to you and helps keep me motivated. Thank you so much.